The Civil War was both a brutal time in American history and a turning point in American history. For the first, say, 60 or 70 years of our nation, we were a people who were, I want to say, divided by a couple things. One, the issue of slavery, and two, the issue of industry. What kind of industry, what kind of economy would we have? The northern states had started to develop major industries. They were expanding away from the farm, building and doing other more well they were experiencing a lot of what happened during the Industrial Revolution. The South, on the other hand, was slower in changing because it was much more agriculture, tobacco, uh, maybe some corn, and of course cotton. That was big. Tobacco and cotton. There were other crops as well, but tobacco and cotton were especially important in the South. And in the South, manpower was absolutely essential. Where'd they get the manpower? From the slaves they imported from Africa. So there was really a slave trade. This became something of an just absolutely appalling to those in the North. And in fact, when the Constitution was formed and when the countries were deciding on being in the Union, it was the issue of slavery that was a sticking point. As a result, there was something called the Three-Fifth Compromise that was created to, I'd say, temporarily resolve the issue because you had questions about taxation and representation. How do you resolve that if in the North they did not agree with the idea that slaves should be treated that way, but in the South, slaves should be considered for the representation, but not for the taxation? It was a difficult sticking point, and the only kind of compromise they could come up with was three-fifths. In other words, for every five slaves, they were counted as three people. Fortunately, that was changed, but there was something else. The fact that the Southern culture looked upon African people, African Americans, as not human beings. Their property was a travesty in itself. And yet it was part of our world that in that day. And it was part of the tension. There was also something else that was happening. You had the original 13 colonies along the eastern coast, but many settlers were moving west to Kansas, Ohio, Iowa, other places. The question was, what would happen to those states? Would they enter as free states or as slave states? So, as is usually the case when it comes to Congress, hasn't changed much in a couple hundred years. There's a lot of pointing fingers and passing the buck that goes on, and it happened back then. And so this passing of the buck and the fact that they didn't want to deal with the issue led to great tensions between the North and the South to the point where in 1861 there were shots fired at Fort Sumter. That was the beginning of the Civil War. The other part of it was the secession of states from the Union. The states decided to secede from the Union because they did not want to be dictated to by Washington about how they conducted their affairs, especially slavery and other matters, as far as the economies and other things that they were developing. So you had a nation that was torn apart. A war started, a war took off. President Lincoln was in the middle of that as President of the United States. In 1863, January 1st, he issued what was called the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves. And his goal was to see a country brought back together with healing. That was his desire. And even during the time of that fight that was going on, where Atlanta, the city of Atlanta was burned, and Gettysburg in 1863 became the most bloody battle of the Civil War. All these events led to the idea of Abraham Lincoln really wanting the country to come together and heal. Unfortunately, he was assassinated right after, just as the Civil War came to an end. The radical Republicans took control, and their desire was to see the Southerners pay a hefty price for their rebellion. And quite honestly, the nation suffered from that for at least 50, 60 years, maybe 2 generations, because people never forgot the military occupation that took place. The Civil War was a very difficult time. The North, dominant industry; the South, great with agriculture. Somehow, the two had to come together, and they clashed. The war broke out, the secession happened. Slowly, these states came back together. But folks, that Civil War just changed everything in this country. Now, in the way of civil rights, it was the beginning. In the way of industry, it was a new beginning. It was just too bad that it took so long to have the wounds that were caused would eventually be healed. It took way too long. That was the impact of the Civil War. Thank you.